And again, there was some industrialization that took place. The Europeans did manage to get some of these people to build factories and man the factories. But they had some difficulties. I mean, some of these people, on their way to work, I mean, they might get a job at a factory, and you'd think they'd want to, get their money together and save the money, but it's often on their way to work, they check their fish trap. No harm in setting a fish trap. But if the trap had no fish, okay, we go to work. Guess what? If the trap had a fish in it, they go home, fix the fish, and say, I need to work today, I've got a fish. Yeah, let's see. In our way of thinking, you say, well, yeah, they should have set the fish trap and checked on their way home from work. And if they had a fish, okay, go home and eat the fish, and the money they saved, store that up for a rainy day, save it, get wealthier, and maybe someday we'll buy some really nice Western stuff. But no, all they wanted was a subsistence living because that was all that they had known. I will say this. There was a time in Lockheed when Lockheed said we're going to farm out to these foreign countries our labor, particularly Mexico. I was working with wire harnesses, and Lockheed was paying its wire harness people $16 an hour. Mexico was paying its workers 90 cents an hour. So Lockheed had the brilliant idea, we'll send these wire harnesses off to Mexico. They laid off 90-some wire harness assemblers. I was not one of them. And they got the first shipment of wire harnesses back from Mexico, and when they did, they called all the 90 people they laid off back from layoff. The wire harnesses were so crummy that Lockheed couldn't use them. I mean, what? 90 cents an hour, and guess what? You got a 90 cent an hour product, and as we'd say at Lockheed, it wouldn't fly. What was wrong with it? Well, almost every wire was wrong. It wasn't wrong. I mean, the wire had to be the right type, have the right numbers on it, it had to be the right thickness, the right gauge, the right insulation, and those people couldn't do it. I mean, yeah, you get 300 Lockheed wire assemblers, and that's about how many we had, and on any given day, 290 of them at least knew what they were doing. 5 of them half knew what they were doing. They were the ones who were called to replace someone who was absent and say, we need this wire. And so they called 5 persons who were maybe somewhat green, half knew what they were doing. And then you had 5 persons perhaps who were green and not really up to the job. Well, the 290 of us who did know what we were doing, we could make up for the 5 or so who didn't. Now go to Mexico. They hired 100 wire assemblers, of whom one of them half knew what he was doing, and the other 99 had no clue. And again, when the wires came back, Lockheed decided no more outsourcing to Mexico. We'd have to spend the money, we'll do it ourselves. Again, it was another problem. If a wire was defective, all they had to do at Lockheed was get on a bicycle, go to the wire fabricator, and say, hey, we need this wire fixed up this way. But what if the wire is made in Mexico? If it's done wrong, you just got to remake it. Maybe make it from scratch. And it turned out almost everything that Mexico sent to us was wrong. Anyway, now some of that has changed. I mean, let's face it, the Mexicans have made good electronic components in recent years, and the people of Singapore and Thailand and China are making really, really good electronic stuff. But sometimes some of this stuff is not of extremely good quality either. All right. Your book talks about how that a lot of your plantation owners, the big plantations were owned by Europeans, and they would keep the workers' wages at a poverty level. And a lot of your plantation hands died because the plantation owners treated their workers with utter disdain and contempt. And of course, this created a whole lot of friction between the mother country and the colony. So in some cases, colonial rule did bring some benefits. In other cases, it brought about more hardship than it had before. And again, when the colonial rule ended, in some cases, the people were better off. In far too many cases, the people were no better off, or if anything, worse off. I want to be talking more later about how these colonies got their independence. All right, Africa. I've already mentioned how that Africa is the most mineral-rich continent on the earth. And a lot of Europeans coveted Africa. Now, I want to say this about Africa. The United States did take over an Asian country, namely the Philippines. The United States never got itself involved in Africa. Your book shows, again, a map on page 621 of all the nations of Europe that took part of Africa. In Spain, Portugal, Great Britain, France, Germany, Italy, and Belgium. All these, now only a couple of places in Africa remained independent. They were Ethiopia, which I've already talked about. Ethiopia was able to get a bunch of guns from Great Britain. But another problem the Italians had, Ethiopia was a mountainous country with a whole lot of desert and a whole lot of poisonous snakes, which the local people have learned how to kind of live around. I mean, poisonous snakes do something by Ethiopians. But the Italians, I mean, were just simply terrified. I mean, these poisonous snakes could come in from seemingly anywhere. Actually, they would slither in from under the ground and come and bite a person. And the Italian army just simply could not seemingly handle the terror that these venomous snakes brought on them. But Ethiopia remained independent, at least except for a 7-year period when Italy eventually did conquer them. And Liberia. Now, Liberia is a unique case. That's one place where the United States didn't get involved, not as conquerors. But before the Civil War, there was an issue of what do we do with our African slaves, because there was a big movement on to free the slaves. And some Americans got the idea, let's ship them back to Africa. So they shipped these slaves, not all of them, but obviously not, but some of them went to Africa. And in Africa, the strong ones took over the weak and they set up a plantation system like what they'd seen in our country, and they began to sell each other into slavery. And one plantation owner would sell his slave to the next, or vice versa. They began to trade in slaves as a slave or merchandise. But Liberia, partly because of American influence, Liberia was left alone. The nation that had the most of, that got the most of Africa was Britain. Britain got South Africa. Let's see, Britain. Egypt and the Sudan. What is today the Sudan? And again, and also what is today Kenya and Uganda. Now Britain still has some interest in Uganda and even in Kenya. Britain had some of these places for a time. And when Britain left, they promised that they would still try to assist these countries any way they could. And anyway, Britain took over Egypt. Italy, as I've already mentioned, got Libya. Portugal got Angola and kept it again until the early 1960s. And the Congo. Oh yes. Now, Holland, before this time, Holland split in two and became two countries. One of these countries is Belgium. And Belgium got the Congo. All right. So with all these European nations coming in and partitioning Africa, it became a real problem for the Africans because the Africans just seemed helpless to fight off the Europeans. The Europeans would use machine guns against the Africans, something they would not at this time do against each other, and later they did. To greatly shorten the route from the sea route from Europe to the Middle East, the French dug the Suez Canal. Now, the Suez Canal joins the Mediterranean Sea to the Red Sea. And again, if you look on a world map, it should be really obvious to you why it's important. It meant that you no longer had to go all the way from Africa. If you wanted to get from Europe to the Far East, you could take the Suez Canal. Now, the Suez Canal has no locks. In other words, it's just a wide, deep ditch that joins the Mediterranean and the Red Sea. It is still in operation. During the 1967 war, it filled up when a bunch of ships were sunk, and it stayed filled up for several years. Eventually, the Israelis agreed to let it be open. But the Suez Canal was dug. The French had tried to conquer Egypt under Napoleon, but France was simply, Napoleon was defeated, sent home, but the British came in with a better organized army and navy, and they were able to conquer Egypt. I must say this about these Muslim countries. I mean, Egypt, as you may know, is a Muslim. Every Muslim country has been conquered at one time or another by European countries. Hardly an exception. Ethiopia was not a Muslim country, but almost every Muslim country has been conquered by outsiders. All right. Now, the conquest allowed Arab merchants to go into Africa, though, and European missionaries also began to go into Africa to Christianize the African people. The most famous of the missionaries was David Livingstone. David Livingstone stayed in Africa for a good many years. In fact, for a long time, nobody heard from him. He was deep in the heart of Africa. He only made, now this is something you don't hear in very many history books, but he only actually made one convert, and that convert was an African chief. The problem was that African chief had 6 wives, and David Livingstone did not know how to explain to him he needed to give up all of them but one. In fact, David Livingstone simply could not solve it. The Islamic people had the same problem with dealing with the Africans, and Livingstone simply did not know how to deal with the issue. Eventually, he gave up being a missionary and became an explorer. And he didn't have a motorboat, but he used a steam vessel to explore the continent of Africa, a steamboat. But during the time he was lost, a reporter went out to meet him. And the reporter eventually found him. And he gave the famous words when he saw one white man in a village full of blacks. Dr. Livingstone, I presume. And Dr. Livingstone said, "Yes, I'm he."